There are many methods for piecing half square triangles. A few different methods that I like to use are 2 at a time, 8 at a time, and triangles on a roll. The most common method for making half square triangles is 2 at a time. The formula we use to determine the size squares needed to make half square triangles is unfinished block size plus 1 inch equals the square needed to make the half square triangles. An example, we need a 2-inch unfinished half square triangle. Add 1 inch and that equals a 3-inch square we need to cut to make our half square triangles. This chart has some of the most commonly used half square triangle sizes needed and what size squares you need to cut to make those half square triangles.
Time to make half square triangles. First up, 2 at a time method. We are going to make 3.5-inch unfinished half square triangles. From our chart, we use the formula, the unfinished half square triangle size, which is 3.5 plus 1 inch equals 4.5 inches. So I have cut 2 blocks at 4.5 inches. I have my dark color and my light color. On my light color, I'm going to turn it onto the back. I'm going to take my ruler. It has a 45-degree angle on it. I'm going to line that up with the side of my fabric. And I'm going to draw a line from point to point. I like to use a Friction pen. It's one I wouldn't use on the front of my quilt, but when I'm using it to mark the back side or something that I'm going to cut, this is a great pen. It shows up great when you're at the sewing machine. So once I am ready, I'm going to layer my dark colored fabric is right side facing up, and then I'm going to layer my light colored fabric right side facing down with that mark on top. Layer them up. I take them to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch on this side of the line and 1/4 of an inch on this side of the line. And we're back from the sewing machine. So as you can see, I sewed 1/4 of an inch from this line down here and 1/4 of an inch from the line on this side. So now what I need to do is cut those apart. I just take my ruler and my rotary and just right like that. Now I'm just going to take those over to the iron and I'm going to give them a quick press. Sometimes I like to give them a quick little finger press to help form so that they don't stretch or distort. And then we'll come back and we will square those up.
If you need a lot of half square triangles, then I suggest the 8 at a time or Magic 8 method. The formula we use to determine the size squares needed to make the half square triangles is unfinished block size plus 1 inch times 2 equals the size square needed to make the half square triangle. For example, if we want a 2-inch unfinished half square triangle block, we add 1 inch, which equals 3, then we multiply by 2, and that gives us the size square we need to cut is 6 inches. This handy chart has the unfinished block sizes, the size they finish at, and the size square to cut for those half square triangles. Now let's head to the sewing machine and make some half square triangles.
Now if you need to make a lot of half square triangles, I suggest doing the 8 at a time method. So that formula to cut out my fabric for another 3.5-inch unfinished half square triangle, I take my 3.5 inches plus 1 inch, add those together, then multiply it by 2. This equals 9 inches. So I cut 2 9-inch blocks, my dark color, and then I have my light color. On my light color fabric, I'm going to draw a line so it forms an X from this corner down to here, and then from this corner down to here. So let me get my ruler out here. This one also has a 45-degree angle, so I can line it up. I'm going to take my pen, I'm going to mark, rotate, mark again. Now this time, I'll of course layer them just like I did with my 2 at a time. My dark square, right side facing up, my light square, right side facing down, so they're together. Then when I take these to the sewing machine, I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch coming down this line all the way across, come back up just like I normally would, and then I'm going to rotate my block and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch from that side and 1/4 of an inch from this side. So let me go to the sewing machine, sew these up, and let's then square up some half square triangles. And we're back from sewing up our 8 at a time. As you can see, I sewed on both sides of those lines. So now what I want to do is I'm going to first cut along all of the drawn lines, so the X's, and then I'll cut down the center and then down the center again. So just like this. So I'm going to take my longer ruler, line it up, make my first cut. I'm going to line up my next cut. Then I'm just going to go right through. So I can now cut, there's a little where the intersection of the 2 lines meet, that's where I now need to cut in between to get my 2 half square triangles out of this. And I do the same on the other side. Go through those where the stitching lines meet, and I'm making sure that my ruler is nice and straight on this side as well as this side. And then cut. And now I have 8 half square triangles that are ready for trimming. All right, now we have our half square triangle that has been pressed and is now ready for trimming. Since this is nice and oversized, so we can trim it down to the correct size. Again, we're going to trim it down to 3.5 by 3.5 inches. My favorite way to trim down half square triangles is using the block lock ruler. It has this nice little groove on the back that will lock into our seam. This is the 3.5 inch block, and I can just lock it right down here. I have the block lock. That is going to go, I always say it goes on the lighter side because I press my fabrics towards my darker fabric. So it goes on the side where your seam allowance is not. So it sits right in here and it locks in your fabric. So now all I have to do is just trim around the block. And I can just rotate this, and if I wanted it smaller, I could get it to 2.5 if I wanted to, but I want it at that 3.5 inches, so I'm just going to use the outer edge of my block, make sure everything is all lined up again, push on my block lock ruler so it's locking in that seam, and cut. And just like that, we have a perfectly trimmed half square triangle ready for sewing. Another tool that you can use to trim your half square triangles is the Clearly Perfect Slotted Trimmer. This ruler, you trim your half square triangles before you iron them. So on here, there's these little black area. This is where your seam allowance is. The dotted line is where you line up your stitching. So I want to make this a 3.5 inch unfinished half square triangle. So I'm lining up my stitching with the dotted line right here. My seam allowance is in that grayed area here, and now all I have to do is trim right here. pull those aside. And then I would just finger press this, then take it to the iron, press it down, and I have a trimmed half square triangle, and I just have to trim off those little dog ears. One last method to make half square triangles is using the triangles on a roll paper. This one is for the 3.5 inch finished half square triangles, and I'm going to make 8 of them. Each of these squares will, just like the 2 at a time, does 2 at a time. So if I did 4 squares, I'll get 8 half square triangles. So I just unroll my paper. And since I want 8 of them, I'm just going to line up my ruler here, right on that black line, and I'm going to cut off the amount I want. For this one, it tells me I should cut my fabrics at 8.5 inches wide by my desired length. So since I'm just going to cut off a square, I'm cut 2 8.5 inch squares of fabric. So just like any other half square triangle method, I have my darker color right side facing up. Then I take my lighter color right side facing down. So they're together. Lay them out. Then I'm going to take my triangles on a roll paper, and I'm just going to lay it on top. And you can see it has some overhang here, and that is by design. These are nice and oversized, so make sure you have enough fabric on the outside of your paper. I'm going to take a couple of pins just to help hold everything together. Just going to pin all the way around in place. And then I will take this to the sewing machine, and we can sew and make our half square triangles. Now the nice thing about this is you can see the arrows. We just have to sew on the dotted line right here. We sew on the dotted line in the arrow, in the direction the arrow is pointing. So here I'm just going to go down here. I'm going to come off my fabric for a little bit, sew, and then I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to come all the way down, and all the way around, and then do the inner circle, the inner square. Then I can come back and we'll trim those up real quick. And we're back from the sewing machine. So now all I have to do is remove my pins. And now I'm going to trim on the dark line here all the way around. Now I'll just trim on all of these solid black lines. So first I'm going to go down the center of each side. And then cut those 2 halves in half again. And then I'm going to cut each square in half. And this will also give me 8 half square triangles that finish at 3 inches, and unfinished they would be 3.5 inches. Just like that. Now to finish all of these, all I need to do, I need to remove the paper. What I did when I sewed is I turned my stitch length down, just like I would if I was paper piecing. So I just fold back that paper, and then I'm just going to give it a little tug, and it just rips off because it perforated the paper. Peel this off, and now all I have to do is take this to the iron, give it a press. I have a 3.5 inch unfinished half square triangle all set, ready to go. Just have to trim off those dog ears, and I'm ready to start sewing this into a block.
We've made our half square triangles, we've trimmed them. Now comes the fun part of playing with different layouts. You can see from this graphic we have so many different ways to lay out our half square triangles and make a finished block. The layout possibilities are endless. This is why half square triangles are one of the most versatile blocks in quilting. So now what you want to do, take those half square triangles, turn them into a block. If you would like to make a sampler with the other blocks that we're making in class, you're going to want to make a 12.5 by 12.5 inch block. And have fun. Pick out your colors, do a couple of test sews, but have fun. Remember, quilting is we're here to have fun. So happy sewing, and thank you for joining me.